Hello world. I'm Lee here with Ruby Gold, and in this video we're going to be getting into the Amusement Park exercise on Exercism's Ruby track. So before we get into it, I just want to take a moment and thank those of you who have watched the previous videos in the series, and especially those of you who have left me any sort of feedback. Feedback has been overall very positive, so that's cool, and really I'm glad to hear, glad to see that anybody's watching these videos. So I guess we're going to continue with this series, which is great because I love doing this series. So jumping into it, let's take a look at exercism here. Exercism kind of interesting. It's not a curriculum that says you have to do one exercise before the other. It does lock you out of exercises, as you can see in this framework. I haven't unlocked any of these yet. But I do have a few exercises that are available to do. So I kind of jumped around and I looked at what was open and made a decision about what I wanted to do next. It's kind of, there is no singular path. Whatever path you choose is going to be the happy path. So if you're also working through exercism and taking your own initiative to go at your own pace, don't worry so much about the order that you tackle stuff in, right? I'm choosing the amusement park path, which is the first one here in instance variables. If you click on instance variables, you can learn a little bit about them. I assume you're going to do that in your own explorations and read through this. I'm going to go right over to the amusement park exercise and let's take a look. I could look through this. I see we're going to be doing some nil stuff and some other actions, but in my typical path, I'm not going to read the instructions first. I'm going to jump into it because much like you can follow whatever path you want through the Ruby track, I'm going to follow the path I want to solving the exercise. And that's kind of how coding is. There's not always one way to proceed. You can sort of follow whatever path you want when you're coding. So let's take a look. Here we are in the exercise. It looks as though I'm going to be writing implementations for 5 different methods, one of which is an initialization method. So when the class is called, the initialization is going to take place, and it looks like when we define an attendee.new, we're going to have to pass in a height to initialize it with. So what I like to do, if you've watched any of the previous videos, is run the tests and find out what fails. So that's kind of interesting, actually. There's 5 tests, so I guess it's potentially 1 test per method. So hopefully this will be, or potentially, maybe not hopefully, this might be a shorter video than some of the previous ones. But let's take a look. And what happened was we ran the code and, so we got a runtime error because we haven't implemented the method yet. So probably what we can do is take a look at what's happening here. And the assertion was height of 100. So if I just clear the method out and run the test again, I should get a different error. Actually, you know what? I should read a little bit more closely. So we still get the same attendee error. Let me undo my changes. And I see that this is actually the attendee height method. And I just want to call this out if you're not familiar with this syntax. We typically will write the Ruby class and then a method after the hash sign, and that sort of indicates that we're calling attendee height, right? If I just jump in here, when we refer to this like in documentation or something, that's what we're actually going to typically write to indicate that. So similarly, we would have, and I'm just putting these in comments, right? Because the class is still attendee. So we have attendee and pass ID. And that's just a syntax, a common way that we will write a class method, a class and its methods to indicate what we're talking about. So I don't need these comments. I could leave them in there, actually. Let's leave them in there for now. We'll take them out later. It's okay. I'm not very big on using comments in code. There are a variety of reasons for doing so. I'm not going to try to explain all the reasons for you, but the sort of the key reason for me is that comments tend to be stale. If you've ever taken over a code base, so if you're watching these videos, you're probably a little bit newer. You might not have experience taking over a code base. You might be writing your own apps. You might be following tutorials. You might be joining a team as a junior developer, and you're kind of getting eased on. But something that you will definitely see is as you progress in your career and you take over other people's code, other code bases, or join other teams, generally speaking, unless the team has a certain culture around comments, comments are going to grow stale. So they can be misleading. They can be completely wrong. They might say, the method does this. Like they might explain something, which could be totally wrong. It could be, maybe 5 changes ago, that's how the comment explained what actually occurs with the method. But 5 changes later, it's no longer true, and nobody updated the comment. Nobody knew to update the comment. So again, I'm not trying to harp on comments too much, but generally speaking, I will avoid comments. Not a big fan, but I'll leave these in here. And hopefully what we do is once we are satisfied that our tests are passing and everything's looking great, we'll go back and just sort of make sure we come and remove these comments. Sort of a standard thing I like to do is just do a final pass, make sure I don't have any puts debugging in my code before I commit it. Sometimes it gets through, but not always. Yes, I am a big puts debugger, as it were. If you have questions about that, ask me if you're not familiar with what that means. But let's go through. And so I was saying that when I changed, oh, you know what? Sometimes I don't always pay close attention. So the way that I removed this actually did pass the first test. So since I put it back, if I run these tests again, my first test should actually fail this time, right? So in theory, I could actually pass 2 tests right now. Not necessarily passing them, but I can change my error messages, right? We can get a different error message, a more useful error message. And one of these actually passes, but this is probably one of those fake passes where, because the test doesn't really seem to check much of anything, I'd love to see how this test is actually assert instance of attendee.new height. So basically, this test is just basically saying, does attendee.new actually create an instance of the class, right? And that makes sense for this exercise because I think, this is our introduction to instance variables. So our test is creating an instance. It is passing in a height. So it is initializing, and it is creating a height. And basically all that we're checking is that an instance is created. So this test logically would pass. It's not a particularly useful test in the grand scheme of things. But it's a test. It's a fair test. I would be fine. That would be a good test to have in your code base as long as it's also supported by other tests, which I'm just looking at this for the first time. So maybe if we're testing all of the methods in here, we can call that pretty good. I kind of would want to. Yeah, I think this second test is basically doing the heavy lifting, right? So we kind of want to make sure that it actually initializes correctly. So let's take a look and see what happens with our second test. So the test still fails because the expected value was 100 and the actual value was 0. So we could cheat, right? Let's just check if we pass in 100, if we basically have it output 100, we pass. But we know that's not real. We know that's not correct. So technically what we should be doing here is returning height, right? Now that's not going to work because what is height? Height in this case would be a local variable and we haven't declared it as anything. So you can sort of like work backwards here. And since you read through the instructions and the introduction, you probably recognize that what we're actually going to be returning is an instance variable height. And if I run that, it should fail because we have not anywhere actually declared the instance variable height. So I kind of thought I was going to get an error message, but I suppose not. I suppose you can return an instance variable that's not really been declared anywhere. The instance variable's value is nil, so that's what we actually got back. So what we would do is come back to our initialization method, right? And generally speaking, what you're going to do is set your instance variable equal to height, right? So if we run that again, our test passes. So we can see when it calls attendee.new, passing in the height, and then we call height, it returns the height. Let's go on and see if that is good enough. So the next test that fails here, oh, it got really bright out. The next test that passes that fails here is checking our pass ID, right? So the test is trying to assert that pass ID should be nil. So, honestly, it's not entirely clear to me what that means. But since the test is assert nil pass ID, right? I should probably put this above. And you may notice I'm not putting return on these. Although that's what we're doing, I'm not putting return here because you probably remember that Ruby will implicitly return, right? So Ruby will return the last essentially argument method. The terminology, the last thing. I'm blanking on the terminology. If you remember, please let me know in the comments. But the last line, right? So the last thing that we declare, that we evaluate, the last evaluation. If we don't specifically return something, Ruby will automatically return, right? So it's not incorrect to do this, right? If we run the test, our first and second test should still pass, right? And our third test passes as well. But we should see no difference, right? If I take these returns out. And arguably, so this is a code style thing, do what your team that you're working on recommends. Your team might use linter, it might use Rubocop, it might use standard, which is an implementation of Rubocop. So it might use something that declares that, but definitely do what your team does. Unless you're working on a solo project, then you can do what you want. But in this case, we should still see all three tests pass. And they do. So I know for me, generally speaking, if I'm not trying to return something special, I will just exclude the return statement because this will get returned. So cool. All right, moving on. Test number 4. So the error itself, right? The implementation. So we know the error is occurring because that's not implemented. So let's get a slightly more helpful message. Okay, so we expected 1, but we actually got nil. So in this case, we returned nil. There's nothing there, right? And that is true. If you're returning nothing, it actually, the method will return nil. So in this case, it's interesting. We actually should be passing in the pass ID. So when we issue the pass, let's see what this should look like. We're expecting 1. So I think in this case, I might not have enough information in front of me, right? So if I pass 1, that fails. So we can't just cheat at it. And if we pass the pass ID, that also fails. So what this indicates to me is that I don't really know what this method does. There's some kind of logic here, like some business logic that I don't have the information about, I'm not fully aware of. And probably what's happening is my pass ID maybe is not giving me what I need. So my pass ID and my attendee pass ID should be equal. So I think I need to look at the instructions at this point and see what actually would be happening here, right? So what is the ride pass ID? So this is interesting. It actually talks about the getter. So it's referring to these as getter methods. I suppose that's fairly common parlance even in Ruby, but we sort of have a lot of tricks in Ruby. We don't really think about those all that much as getters and setters. We don't write really these all are all getters and setters, and I'm trying not to jump ahead because there's a sort of a way that we cheat in Ruby to write these a lot more quickly. So this is one of those cases where reading the instructions may have actually helped me understand the exercise. But it looks like we're on this one. So implement the issue pass. And the idea is we're mutating the state of the instance and setting the pass ID instance variable to the argument. So it should return the pass ID. So if we're passing in 106 as the height, and issue pass is that. So in this case, we are probably I feel like I'm not understanding something here. Let's see what happens if we run that. Still not quite right. So, and this doesn't really make sense to me. So let's see what the hints reveal. So the idea is to set the instance's state to the argument. So I guess the question is, what state are we talking about exactly? All right, so I'm going to take a moment here and sort of read back through some of the stuff that's going on in here. I'm going to let you follow along so I can sort of see I'm trying to balance solving the exercise by following the tests with also kind of understanding what it's doing. So I'm trying to use as little information as possible, but sometimes I need to see what the exercise is trying to do. Because again, I'm not trying to jump ahead to what future lessons will cover, but I don't really know in what lesson some things are taught. So if it without sort of knowing, I just have to kind of make sure I'm seeing what I'm doing here. So possibly what they want me to do, because they're talking about getters and setters, they probably want me to initialize a pass ID method. which kind of makes more sense about this here. So I think that's what they want me to do here. This did seem kind of strange to me that I would just return nil. So probably, since we're talking about getters and setters, I would probably initialize my class attendee with a pass ID of nil, because I'm not initializing it with that, right? I'm not calling, when I create an attendee, so my attendee equals attendee.new, I'm sending it a height, right? 106, whatever the values are, 100, 106, 150, whatever the values are. It's an amusement park, so it's probably like centimeters, inches. Well, I don't think anyone's 150 inches tall, so probably centimeters. Right, so we're sending it a height, but we're not sending it a pass ID, make one up, right? Because that's not the definition, and that's not what we necessarily want to do. And because there's like some business logic behind that, it kind of makes sense that like that information is probably not available at the time that we initialize things. So I think what we're trying to do is just setting a default pass ID of nil. And then what that allows us to do is for this method here, we would just return that pass ID. And let's remove this so it's not an issue. So if we run these tests, we should still be passing the one that asserts a nil. Let's see, can we put a focus mode on? Okay, cool. We got a focus mode on. So we're still asserting that pass ID is nil because we initialize our attendee class with this. And since the instructions talk about getters and setters, that this is probably the implementation that they wanted us to do, which I think this is great because it shows again how we can still pass tests even with the wrong implementation. And sometimes we got to explore and tease things out a little bit. So I think that was a pretty valuable exercise. And I hope that if you're following along, that all made sense to you. And you sort of saw like we had things working. There are very few tests, right? And that's a big part of why we were able to sort of sneak by, because there were very few tests implemented, or well, very few tests written. And so the only test for pass ID really was checking that it was nil. So what we get to do here then is essentially we can modify this so that we are setting pass ID equal to that. So when something calls, and maybe it would be better to write these actually up here. So when something calls this method, right? So when something calls this method, ooh. Okay, so you can't outdent. I was trying to use a keyboard shortcut to outdent, right? As opposed to indenting, I was trying to outdent. But apparently that just goes back in the browser. So it would probably be more fair to write these out here, and I'm going to get rid of them anyway, so it's not too important. But basically what I suspect is now the test will actually call issue pass and send in a pass ID, which would be 1, right? And then assert equal. So now it's going to issue the pass, and then our pass ID, which we declare as a local variable, should be equal to our attendee.passID, right? And you see we're still doing this. So this is the code that runs, right? The runner, it's behind the scenes. This runs when we click on run tests. So now we should see that this should pass. And let's find out if that's true. Yeah, okay, there we go. So did a little bit of, I had to just kind of look in here to see sort of like what we're actually doing. And I think we're gonna have a lot of fun when we get to a different exercise that has something that's way more useful than some of this stuff. But this is all, you have to learn this stuff, right? You gotta learn the building blocks, the basics, before you really get too far ahead of yourself. So anyway, as long as this is using the correct version of Ruby, I'm going to take a shortcut here and do multi-assignment on a single line. So you can see the first assignment is first and the second assignment is second. And what we should get is that my test should all still pass. Good. Okay. It's not necessary to do this, but I kind of like it. I'm always sort of trying to write less code. Now, sometimes less code means fewer lines of code. And it's sort of a trivial thing, right? We kind of cut out a line of code. We didn't really cut out any characters per se. I don't know. You can count the number of spaces and new line characters, but we didn't really change the amount of code. What we did was we shortened the length of the file, which is by itself, like, don't necessarily make that a goal, but you'll sort of find that it's easier to read shorter files, and like there's sort of this background information, which we're not going to cover right now, but these like rules for programming, especially for object-oriented programming, and like short methods, like you'll see this over time, how like the most beautiful code you'll see tends to be like short, a lot of short stuff, especially in object-oriented programming, which is how a large majority of Ruby code is written. And this is just one of those little things, if I'm initializing two getters, setters, getters. Sorry, I'm going back and forth. Don't worry about it too much. I mean, it's probably all explained in the instructions here. So read through the instructions that they give you here on Exercism. But yeah, so these are getters. This one is actually kind of a setter. I wonder, do they call it that? I sort of behind the scenes, we're kind of doing that. Not really, but kind of. Sort of inadvertently, like in a roundabout way. Anyway, I digress. So we have one more test. And again, we're raising, so our error message is not particularly useful, but let's take a look and see what happens. So in this code, we set a height, we create an attendee, we set a pass ID, and we issue a pass, and then we revoke a pass. And what we are doing is refuting the attendee.passID. So expected one to be not truthy. So that's kind of interesting. I'm just curious what yeah, that's what I thought, that they just want the simple, just essentially set it. So basically what we did here, we're doing the inverse of issuing the pass. We're revoking it. So we're kind of just going back to setting pass ID equal to nil. And it looks like that test passes. So this is, I think I'm making this up. Is there a method? No, yeah, I didn't think so. I just got curious. Sometimes you can do stuff in Ruby that like really surprises you. This was not one of those times, but it's good to, it's always good, I think, to explore, right? Kind of going back to what we were talking about in the beginning of this video. there's not one right way to do everything in programming. There are arguably better ways to do many things, but there's not one right way. And really, you're going to have a lot of fun with programming if you feel free to explore and play around, and do kind of fun stuff. So that was just a very quick exploration of something that I didn't expect to work, but I was just very generally curious. So there may be something related to that. Feel free to explore that on your own. But the only last thing I want to point out here is that these are bang methods. So that exclamation point itself doesn't do anything in these methods, right? The difference being, so this would not work. This would not work for a variety of reasons, right? Because it doesn't change, it doesn't mutate the state of pass ID. In the instance where you call this, it would, I guess, technically return the correct thing, right? To make this work, you would have to do like, you wouldn't write code like this. I hope not. Like that's not, that's kind of weird. It's not really, it doesn't care what pass ID is really, basically, in a sense, unless pass ID was, well, let's not get into it. Like the point though is here, like this kind of changes, like it's a little bit like this exclamation point is meaningful. It's an operation. So it basically, is saying not, right? Not at pass ID, right? So if pass ID, which would be a positive number in this scenario, is a truthy statement, we're checking that it's not truthy, or we're making it not truthy. So it is truthy, so we're doing the inverse of that, so it's not truthy. Kind of, yeah. This is part of why you would never do something like this. But the point is, this carries like meaning, it like changes something. In these method definitions, it's really just, we're just really doing it for the purpose of signifying that this method itself is dangerous, right? Bang, it's dangerous. It changes something. If you run this method, it's not just a getter. It's not just going to get you information. If you run this method, it's going to change something. So like, be careful when you're writing code that calls this method. Make sure that you're calling it with the intention of changing something. So, all right, let's run the test one more time. Make sure this is all good. Yep. So we're just going to quickly submit this so that we can get the automated feedback to point out if there's anything. I'm not going to do a code review, but I always recommend that on Exercism. You will always be surprised with the additional information that the mentors on here can provide. I just want to make sure that the automated tool doesn't suggest any changes. So I feel like every time I come to Exercism, things are a little bit different. Yeah, no auto suggestions. That's what I was looking for. So I'm going to submit this. I'm going to mark it complete. I only have one iteration in this case, so cool. I could go back. We're not going to do any further exercises during this video, but now I have submitted that. It kind of goes into the pile of community solutions, but it's not going to be distinct from anything else. Probably it's identical to several of these. As always, I also recommend you check out community solutions once you're done. So I do see that some of these are getting into like other stuff that we don't necessarily need or want to do. Although I do kind of like the way that this one, so this is like thinking ahead, where you can have the option of passing in a pass ID. And if you don't pass in a pass ID, it'll be nil. So thinking that through, that's kind of like maybe you have someone who already has a pass and you're trying to register them and they already have a pass ID, so you don't need to issue you're not going to need to issue a pass. They already have one, right? So that's kind of like the flexibility of what this would allow, thinking through like, so we looked at this code in isolation, but the point of the code was like, it's object-oriented programming. Like these are real things. Like an attendee is a real thing that we can model, and passes are real things. And they, there's real things like these are passes for amusement parks. So thinking that through, somebody might have a pass and they're not registered yet. And so when we register them, we can supply a pass ID and just automatically store that. And then attendee pass ID would spit that out. And if you don't, the default is going to be nil. So that does remind me that if we go back, let's go to my iteration, and we forgot to remove these comments. That in itself is not a problem, except I did go on a big thing about how I don't like comments in code. So just deleting those, and that's what we got, right? So the thing I was saying is we could pass in pass ID and default it to nil, but we don't need that yet. And in this exercise, we're not going to need it. Right, so I have to run the test first, and then I can submit. I'm not going to wait, and okay, so it's published. We're good. Cool. So, yep, I can see that my solution doesn't have that. This is probably one of so many. There's probably so many solutions that follow this. Once this video goes up, you'll see it will also be available in the tab here for, there's a dig deeper icon or a tab which only appears when there's videos, and this video will contribute to that. So yep, a little bit of a shorter video this time around. I appreciate you watching it through all the way. We do take our time with these. Obviously, if you're sitting down and writing the code, you can solve these much faster on your own. Many of you watching this video probably have solved it much faster on your own, and that's all well and good. But we like to explore and really sort of dig into that. And that's what these videos are for. If you recall, if you watched the previous videos or the introduction to the series, right? I'm here to try and provide you mentorship. And if you were pairing with me on code, this is the kind of conversation that we would be having and the way that our pairing sessions would go. And I hope that you find some valuable nuggets in here, because I want you to remember, well, first of all, yeah, if you're watching this, yeah, you gotta pay the piper. If you're watching this on YouTube, like, share, and subscribe. Do all the stuff, whatever. I don't even know what it is on YouTube. I think there's like thumbs up and subscribes, whatever. If you're watching this on Exercism, I don't really know if there's anything to do. Okay, piper is paid. But yeah, so I hope we teased out at least some kind of a nugget in there for you, a useful little nugget that if you crack open, might have some gold in it, because remember, there's gold in them there rubies. All right, take care.